For our last panel, we have Richard Ellis, my predecessor, the great treasurer of the state of Utah, and the current senior director for compliance, communications, finance, and investments at My 529. And they were, of course, the providers of this nifty swag college savings packet and pen. Be sure and take advantage of this. If your children, your grandchildren, your neighbors' children and grandchildren don't have 529 accounts yet,
I expect at least 180 new accounts by Friday, or if you already have one, I expect your contribution to go up by $25 a month.
That's we actually promised Richard we would try to accomplish that, so please help. Also joining us for this last session, Andy Sears, Executive Vice President of Public Finance and General Counsel for George K. Baum and Company, and David Hitchcock with S&P Global. And David, we will have you on every single panel every time you come to town again, because I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I appreciate you chiming in for us on P3s. That was an interesting conversation. I wanted to start with Richard. Richard walked in with me to the Office of State Treasurer in 2009, right as the you-know-what was hitting the fan, and Richard was at the helm of Utah's Treasury for 7 years through that period. At almost the same time, starting in October of 2012, Richard joined the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board. And so he's been there through the thick of it all, pretty much. I think things were really getting going with the MSRB about the time that Richard joined the board. And so I'm curious to know, Richard, just looking back, what really, well, first of all, when are you releasing your book, your tell-all book? Or in lieu of your tell-all book, what can you tell us in a few minutes? What was that like, and what are some of the more memorable moments during your service on the MSRB board through the past 5-6 years?
That's a great question, and I've signed an NDA.
Next question.
No, being on the MSRB has been really a fascinating experience, and as an issuer, you see one side of a transaction. As an investment banker, you see a side of the transaction. As somebody on a trading desk, you see another side of a transaction. And there's no one person that's really an expert across all phases of this. And, remember with Dodd-Frank, it expanded the MSRB. It made it a public member majority, which was a new step forward. And on the board, there's a requirement to have banker representatives, broker-dealer representatives, regulated MAs now. On the public side, issuers, as well as investors and just general public. And so you bring together a conglomeration of lots of different perspectives and viewpoints. When I first came on the board, you have to realize the SEC had just come out with their 2012 report on the market, which became somewhat of a prioritization of what we needed to accomplish as a board. And I remember going to my first board meeting in October of 2012, and they sent us out a packet about 2 weeks in advance. And the packet was, 800 or 900 pages. And then the next packet came, and then the next one. So overall, I think I ended up with about 1,200 pages of reading to get through in 2 weeks. And we were just starting to gear up and talk about the MA rule and what we were going to do with it. And so that was just huge. And now we bring new board members on, and they start that first meeting, and they get a packet of 250 pages and another one with 50 pages, and they go, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And I said, this is nothing. This is just one night's reading. You can be done with it. Now, there's efficiencies that come with time as a board member. But, I think it's important to remember sometimes it's always easy to look from the outside in and say, those guys that got their heads buried in the sand, they just don't get it. But I think because the board has such broad representation, we do get it. There's a lot of things that are discussed in board meetings. A lot of different opinions, and one of the phrases we use is you check your jersey at the door. When you go in there, you're representing the market. You're not representing yourself as an issuer or as an underwriter or as someone on a trading desk. You're really trying to say, what can we do to make this market more efficient and to protect those over whom we have responsibility? Because remember with Dodd-Frank, It had always been investors up until then. So since 1975, 5, 6, somewhere in there when the MSRB was created, we really were out there to protect investors. Dodd-Frank expanded that to protect issuers. And how do you protect an issuer and investor? The last I checked, they're kind of on opposite sides of a transaction. And then they threw in public pension plans, and 529s had got thrown in back in the mid-90s. And so it's kind of a different world. So as you come together and talk about these things. You know, I have seen people that have long careers in the banking industry that when they check their jersey at the door, I've seen them vote for things that were not advantageous to them as a firm, but they were the right thing, I think, to do for the market. And I see that time and time again. And so when we see some of these rules that come out, we can't say that everything we do is going to be perfect and that there aren't things, but a lot of the things, the comment letters, we read all the comment letters. They're part of those 1,200-page packets. If you have the right rule out there on the street, we read all of those individually as board members. Staff goes through them. They summarize them. We still read them individually. We talk about them. We talk about the salient points, and then we see sometimes they go out for another request for comment to get even more information, more feedback on it, and we make adjustments because we miss things. But, by and large, I think the process works fairly well, but there will always, I think the measure of success is if nobody's happy, we've probably done the right thing because the issuers aren't happy, the MAs aren't happy, and the investment bankers aren't happy, so we probably have a really good rule then. If everybody were happy, then there's probably some inefficiency in the market because somebody's making lots of money somewhere.
That's a great answer. Were there any points at which there was or any particular issues over which there was particularly tough conversations between this? You get this new blend between issuers and underwriters, the banking community. Where did the fireworks start cropping up?
Oh, I won't give you any specifics on anything like that, but there are discussions there. But I think each issue that comes along is different, and the expertise on what it is. A lot of things out there on pre-market trading, and markup is the most recent one that's had everybody up in arms. And when you start talking about markup and what's happening on a trading desk and how the bonds are being sold and the confirmations are going out, I have to admit as an issuer I'm not really good at that. So I can't get real involved in those discussions. Other issues you could talk about, the MA rule, where it was. I think one of the interesting ones, G17, when it came out, I think that came out before I got on the board, so I don't know what they were. And you'll notice that I think we just went out on that, didn't we, Rita, on G17 to look at that again, because as an issuer, you're getting inundated. Either you're getting a blank form that you get from an underwriter talking about these things, or you're getting one from everybody in a syndicate that's there, and so you're maybe getting overloaded. So we got to find the right balance. But I think at some point you have to come out and do something to try to protect the interests over those whom you have responsibility, and then go back and look at it again. So I think it's a good time to look at G17. It's been about 10 years out there, 8 or 10 years, and can we improve that? Can we make it more efficient? And you'll see that the MSRB, we've really pivoted. We're moving away from a lot of new rulemaking, but in keeping up with that SEC report, there were a lot of things that I think needed to happen in the municipal market. I think the MSRB has taken that on, tackled most of those challenges, still a few things to clean up. But really, it's now reaching into that world of how can we provide guidance out there? How can we provide education? It's always that challenge. How do I get the water to the end of the row? How do I get to that individual investor? We talk a lot about institutional investors, and they have great knowledge and great resources to them. But mom and pop, where are they in there? When you read the reports, it says, well, gosh, 40, 50, 60% of the market's owned in retail. We'll define what retail is. Is it mom and pop? Is it through a mutual fund? Is it a separately managed account? It happens a lot of different ways. And so you have to consider all those things as you do it. So, I wouldn't say there's been really heated differences between public members, regulated members. I think discussions are all very professional, and we all know what the end goal is. So there's really nothing that really jumps out, David, in that regard.
I'm trying to remember the name of that host. Jerry Springer. I was hoping for a Jerry Springer moment there, Richard, but you failed miserably. Andy, what are you hearing from the SEC Office of Municipal Securities and MSRB on their regulatory and enforcement, more so, priorities for the rest of the year?
So it's always fascinating to talk to our regulators. Rita mentioned something this afternoon when she was talking about MS, saying, reach out and talk to the MSRB about that. I highly encourage anyone to do that. We are a self-clearing firm, and so we get examined every year by FINRA. We don't see that as a challenge. We see it as an opportunity to be able to talk with them about what best practices are and to get their feedback. I think it's also very important to stay involved as an industry. So just last week, I had the opportunity to be in Washington, D.C., meeting with an industry group where we regularly meet twice a year with the SEC, the MSRB, and FINRA, all at the same time, to have them in the room so they can hear each other talk to us about where they're headed in the coming months and coming years. On the enforcement front, you never get anybody from enforcement there because that's all confidential. So what you get is someone from the Office of Municipal Securities who tells you what they are hearing from their colleagues, and then you have to look back and see what actions have been taken so that you can get a feel for where enforcement staff is headed. So in this post-MCDC world, they're really focused now on two themes, and you've heard about them already today. It's about stellar disclosure, that's their phrase, and meaningful disclosure. That's kind of right behind what the point that Richard was raising about looking at G17. Simply getting forms from people, forms from underwriters that are rote and don't have any content in them and are sent early in the process as they're required to be, but don't really help the issuer community. We really have to sort of question whether that needs to be adjusted. On the enforcement front, they have shifted. And remember, this is a very limited staff of attorneys, so they're going to go only after the really bad folk. And it's all focused on the anti-fraud provisions. They don't have jurisdiction over the issuance of municipal securities, but the SEC always has jurisdiction over fraudulent conduct. Ramapo, New York is the most recent example of that, where they've gone directly after 3 issuer officials. And it's the assistant town attorney who was also the executive director of their local development authority. They went after the deputy finance director and the town attorney. And what they found is that in a series of 5 issuances over 6 years, they deliberately misrepresented financial troubles that they were having associated with a $60 million baseball stadium that they'd built. And one of the things they tried to do to sort of correct that was to come up with a sale that never took place. So it was a fictitious sale, and yet all that came through look in their OSs that were part of their public offerings without any commentary whatsoever. So those 3 individuals have been barred from life from any municipal issuance. Each one of them has been fined $25,000, $20,000, and $15,000 respectively, given what their roles were. The lawyer's been disbarred. All of them have been fired, required to be fired, and 2 of them are allowed to return to work for the city, but only after a 7- and 5-year period and never working on a municipal bond issuance. Well, what good does that do? So you say, isn't that kind of an extreme example? Yeah. Oh, by the way, the mayor, the town supervisor, has been, the SEC has not finished its civil investigation of him. He was criminally charged. He's been sentenced to 30 years in prison and a $75,000 fine, just because the OS wasn't accurate. And his defense was, I'm the supervisor, I'm the mayor, I'm the superintendent. I don't have to look at that. I've got people who do that for me. If you are the head of an issuing entity, the responsibility starts with you. So they're trying to deliberately scare everybody into compliance with stellar disclosure using an extreme case. So just to make sure you don't feel that we're picking on issuers, there's also an MA firm in Oklahoma where not only the individual who is providing advice for a client on a transaction, but also his supervisor have been barred for 6 months and suffered personal fines. And here's the one thing that they was the focus of their misconduct. On the advice of bond counsel, an issuer simply took their CDU requirements that required that something be filed 280 days from the end of their fiscal year and said, we're going to do it a year. And they didn't get the consent of all outstanding bondholders, and they didn't get a legal opinion saying that they had done that in a legal manner. That was viewed to be a violation of the fiduciary responsibility to the client, and those two individuals were barred. So the SEC is looking at the conduct, but it's all focused on disclosure and documentation, which is the themes you heard.
Andy, you're touching on this control person liability issue, and I want to stay on that for a second. We have people involved with charter school finance here, higher education, cities, counties, across the spectrum. And I've heard the example of the mayor, but can you elaborate a little bit? Where's the line drawn within which you might find yourself subject to control person liability in different types of organizations? Can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great example, a great question. So in those settings where you are a conduit issuer and you've got a conduit borrower who's responsible for those obligations, there should be a very clear contractual commitment between the two that it is the conduit borrower who has those responsibilities for making the disclosures and for any of the representations that are made in an official statement. Those provisions in an OS that are coming from the conduit issuer should be very clearly limited just to that. So if you are the head of the conduit borrower, you would still have that control person liability. But one way you can attempt to limit that for the head of the conduit issuer is to clearly, contractually, and in writing, again, clearly disclosed in an OS, say you're looking over here at the other guy who is the conduit borrower.
David, I wanted to shift to you now. We have what I think is an unprecedented number of ballot initiatives coming up this year in Utah. It's not, I've only lived in Utah for 20 years, but I really don't think this has been a thing like it is this year ever before. Can you talk to us a little bit about how S&P Global and I guess rating agencies in general, if you want to speak to that, view ballot initiatives? We don't have anything like Tabor coming up, but you still have that same dynamic from a political standpoint. What's the general view from a rating agency standpoint?
So the ability to have ballot initiatives is an explicit part of our rating criteria, and it's a negative rating factor. But the relative level is something that we also score. So basically, we're just looking at the risk side of the equation, not the reward. And so uncertainty is risk. And so if you have the ballot process, it's extra risk. But some states have initiative processes that are so cumbersome, like Montana, you almost never can get anything on the ballot. So we also grade it by how easy it is to get on the ballot, and then what's the history. So it's not uncommon in California to have 60 ballot measures, and how can a voter, when they get the voter pamphlet and get a discussion of 60 ballot issues, go into the voting booth and have an informed decision? So that's, and some of them have some major impact. So we look and see what's the history of voter initiatives that actually have an impact on the budget. So you can have a lot of initiatives, but they could be social issues that have nothing to do with the budget. So Utah does not have a history of a lot of major ballot initiatives that affect the budget. And we were talking earlier about how some states just have a culture of either budget rectitude or budget process. And I think it's fair to say that those states that have a lot of voter initiatives will probably have a lot of voter initiatives next election too. And so we don't see Utah as being particularly volatile in terms of the initiatives, and that also it only has statutory law effect. Sometimes, like in California, it's a constitution. Can't change it until maybe another election, if at all. And then there's places like Maine where the voters put initiative in, only has statutory power, and the legislature just ignores it. This has happened multiple times in Maine. So you have to say, well, what good is the initiative there? So I would say Utah is somewhere in between. It's a mild negative, I guess. We have a AAA rating on the state. We don't think that an initiative is going to come out that's going to have a major impact on the budget that the state can't handle. And I think that's the way we look at it. If something did happen, we might change our assessment.
Generally, what we have coming is relatively innocuous, except for the Medicaid expansion. That's a significant one for us. Considering rating agencies have tremendous analytical capabilities, you have economic data, demographic data. For those of us that come to you and other rating agencies, make presentations, what can we provide that's most helpful, that's most additive, and such that we're not telling you things that you already know?
So there are things, and we do like to have management meetings, and we're not under any illusion that you meet someone for 2 hours and you know everything about them or the management, but it's helpful. And we frequently get calls from investors, so people might not be aware of this, but we interact with the investment community, and they'll say, what did you think of management when you met with management? And I think it's useful. So we have explicit scoring on written management policies, and the information that we have is national. So we look at the federal statistics, the Census, Department of Commerce. We have a subscription to, used to be Global Insight, now it's AHS Market. But what we don't have is the local granularity. So like we don't know what's happening with your major employer. So information that's very local is helpful. Information on your debt plans, financial plans, changes in management, some of the challenges you're meeting very locally, that we're very interested in. We can't get that necessarily even from an official statement. How forward-looking management is. So one of the key factors for ratings, state and local government, is structural balance. So how are people planning to make sure that they can maintain that structural balance, ongoing revenues, meeting ongoing expenditures? I could go into a lot of different things, but basically the local things are the things that we're missing, and also sort of how you react as a manager to local problems and planning. I see, full disclosure, you gave me a list of some of the questions in advance here. One of them was like, how can you get a better rating? And one of them right off the bat is have written management policies that you actually adopt and follow in a formal way. You don't have to change your economy to do that. And so we might discuss some of those things, and that would be some of the things we'd look at.
Thanks. I'd like to stop and check to see if we have any questions. We had a hard time deciding how to entitle this session, because this session is really whatever we want to talk about. That's what this session is. And we have people here that can address anything you might want to ask, honestly, between a rating agency, state treasurer / self-regulatory organization, regulator, and an investment bank, legal eagle. Anything you want to talk about, this is a great group. So if there are any questions, we're happy to take one from the audience or more, if there are any. I shouldn't have told you about the extra sandwiches. Mark has a question. Thanks, Brittany.
This may be a silly question, but I've got thinking about it today about continuing disclosure. And if you're an employee or an elected official or somebody, you sign the continuing disclosure document when you close an issuance. What happens to your liability once you leave office, or your responsibility, I guess, is the question.
You're not considering retiring, are you, Mark?
Certainly not. No.
So first of all, I'm not authorized to practice law in the state of Utah. See your local Utah attorney on that answer, but generally it's unlimited. There are statute of limitations on fraud actions, so you get a little bit more comfortable after 5 years, but there are some states that have no statute of limitations on liability. So if you have someone in Ohio that buys that, they could bring an action against the entity. The likelihood of them coming against you personally is pretty remote.
Okay,
And
but-
signing the CDU is just your commitment to do something in the future. It would be the issuer officials who are signing the OS that's got the backward-looking statements about what has actually occurred. Great
Okay,
question.
so again, to clarify, I'm not concerned about anything that I've ever done to be fraud or such, but for my responsibility for.
You're asking for a friend?
Yeah, I'm asking for
a friend.
For the responsibility of continuing disclosure after you're gone, does that continuing disclosure responsibility go away?
Is this a retirement announcement, Mark?
I just told David I'm not planning on retiring until.
When are you going to
2.5 years.
retire? I was kidding.
Yeah, unfortunately, no. If I could touch on just one other brief question was asked earlier today, and it has to do with the amendments to 15C212 and why they're not going to take the provision out regarding notices of rating changes now that all of the rating agencies are already voluntarily reporting on Emma. The answer is that they are focused like a laser beam on the two additional disclosure elements that are proposed to be added. And while the SEC Office of Municipal Securities agrees that it probably sometime in the future to take off the requirement for ratings changes, because all of the four applicable national rating services have not been voluntarily posting data for at least 5 years, looking back, it's not really helpful for your five-year look-back analysis. Well, you're probably not going to see that removed for a number of years. The two other things they're adding, people talked today about the first of the two proposed additions, and that is when you've got a material financial obligation. And we do have a little bit of hope that there's going to be some carve back from that to at least remove operating leases. But the other one, so the proposed 16th disclosure item that you would have to report within 10 days is any time an issuer incurs financial difficulties. And it is as wide open and overbroad and undefined as you would ever want to see. And the bad news I got to tell you that I have to share with you today is that Chair Clayton has put those two amendments on 15C212 on what's called the red flex notice, meaning the commission is going to take action on this before the end of this year. The SEC's Office of Municipal Security still hasn't processed over 90 comment letters that came in, which, by the way, were over 90% negative. And they have not yet made their recommendation to the commission. It's likely we're going to get at least two new elements, perhaps carved back, but you're going to be all confronted with a strange conversation with all of your bond counsel, your MAs, with your underwriters about what is an experience of financial difficulty that we should have reported. And if we didn't do that, do we have to put that in an OS now going forward? It's going to be complex.
And you brought up an issue there that was really important. It's okay to send in positive comment letters to SROs, right? I haven't seen one, but it's okay, right?
Well, we do it all the time. We think that some amendments to 15C212 would be brilliant. It's just not the two that have been focused on.
I have a question. If you think back to Rita's sessions on Emma, how many of you saw something new that you didn't know was there on the Emma website? So Richard made a comment about this, and this is one of the focal points of this whole event. Is MSRB is in a time of change themselves in a number of ways. There's this constant revamping, if you will, and enhancement to the Emma website. And there's a shift from rulemaking to education and guidance, and Richard referred to that. The MSRB is an SRO, but it's regulating something of which we are all a part. Those of us that issue bonds or receive proceeds from the issuance of bonds. So, Richard, for you being on the MSRB board, as long as you have and having the depth of understanding you have of the MSRB, I'm sitting here thinking the MSRB is kind of like our Pied Piper as an industry. We should follow closely with them. We should be intimately aware of the resources that they have available. So you've been in the shoes of an issuer and a banker over many years of your life. So having all of those perspectives, what's your advice for us? How do we get the most out of what MSRB has to provide?
I think that's a great question, David, and I must be getting older. My mind went blank. I think you really need to understand what's going on. You know, like any entity, your computer systems get old, and we at the MSRB, we're in the process of revamping a lot. Rita mentioned the short system has been revamped. The RTRS system that you have to report within so many minutes, that's just been redone. Emma had the new look that came out. We're not done with Emma. Understand that was just kind of the first phase, and so as you're, using Emma, posting information there, let us know what you think, if there are things that would be improvements. And, this is, I think, a big step forward from an issuer perspective. It's not to say there can't be more in the future, and we expect more to be happening in the future with regard to issuers and how they can use Emma to be beneficial. I think from the MSRB perspective, if we could be what we would like to be, would be that place that was your entity, your state, your city, your county, whatever you are, would be your investor information portal. That you would voluntarily find this so useful that you would voluntarily go out and put your budget information out there. You would put, any type of thing that's out there. When I was at the Treasurer's office, we started our investor information portal out there. We update that or try to keep that updated. We, as this, if I'm still there, but just in spirit I am. My name's there anyway. I think it's a great thing, but I think Emma could be that, because when you talk to investors, especially at the institutional level, they want to go to Emma because they know there are certain things there that they're looking for. And if they could actually, from Emma, you can have a link that goes to your site, but they would prefer just to stay within Emma and access the information you have. So from an MSRB perspective, I think would love to be that ultimate resource. Now, I don't know that it ever will be, because as the tendency is in government, we love to control our own world, our destiny, our fiefdoms, whatever they are, and so we want to have our investor portal. And if I were state treasurer, I'd still want my own investor portal, so I'll be upfront about that. But I think there's so many things out there. And then I think from an educational perspective, how many of you had heard about Muni Ed Pro before? How many of you taken the classes from Muni Ed Pro that are free to you as issuers? Yeah, there's 2, right, that are free to issuers out there. You probably ought to take them because you'll learn something. And they don't take that long to get through. They have a little test. You're not going to be held accountable. They don't send the results to your supervisor or anyone else that has oversight over you. But I think they're there for a real educational purpose. And we purposely put 2 out in the first 12, 15 months to make sure that issuers were learning certain things and they understood the process. There's just nice videos on kind of what the process is, which would probably be great to walk through with your city councils, your county commissions, your board of trustees on the bonding process, so that they could just see what's involved, who the professionals are, why is there a bond counsel, why is there a disclosure counsel, why might you want to use a municipal advisor? What's the role of the underwriter? How does this all happen? Those are all important things, and those kinds of resources are available out on the MSRB website, not Emma specifically, but the MSRB website, that I think would be very beneficial to everybody sitting in this room, and probably to a factor of that of employees within your organization. So I think you really ought to look to the MSRB as a place you can learn about the bonding process, get great information, because our purpose is to be an impartial provider of information. And we try to do that with regard to what's going on in DC. When issues come up on an infrastructure plan, people want to know what's happening. We want to be the one that can provide them factual information. We don't want to lobby a position, but be able to be a resource to provide that. And that's what investors are looking for also. So I think the MSRB can be a great resource if you'll just spend some time on the site or call in, send in an email. You'll find the people, most of them are pretty nice, because the attorneys you don't have to deal with, the rest are really nice people.
Rita's the nicest. We love Rita. David, this is a really, we've been down in the weeds quite a bit today. This is kind of a high level question. We've looked back at Dodd-Frank. We've looked back at the Great Recession. Thinking about Dodd-Frank and the impact on rating agencies in general. If you met someone in an elevator and you were trying to explain to them, first of all, what you do working for a rating agency, but secondly, if you were trying to explain to them succinctly, what has it been like, and what were the implications for you and your firm as a result of the crisis in Dodd-Frank? How would you explain that?
Well, the quick answer is, well, our records are in really great shape. So Dodd-Frank didn't tell us what criteria we should use for rating. Each rating agency still has their own criteria. Basically, the SEC has just told us, you say what the criteria is, but we're just going to monitor that you follow what you say you're going to say. And I think in the public finance area, we've always pretty much done that, but maybe the record keeping wasn't, as extensive. The SEC comes in and regularly looks at our files and makes sure every file folder has every piece of paper. And I think it is a little more transparent. So now we have a request for comment period when we propose new criteria like the priority lien criteria, which I think is all to the good. There's a longer process you might have seen to get a rating. So when you apply for a rating, we take a little longer because we have to have certain procedures, or becoming a little bit more like a bank or government maybe, a little more bureaucratic. So you should count on maybe a slightly longer process. But I'm not sure if it's really changed us that much. We are trying to go through systematically our criteria and make it much more transparent, more extensive, have this request for comment period. But our criteria has always changed somewhat in response to events. The other thing, I guess there's a separation, a greater separation between the business side and the analytical side. I can't even talk to the people on the business side now, so don't ask me about fees. I love it as an analyst. I don't have to sell, don't have to do with any business at all. But maybe it makes your business a little harder because you have to deal with two people. I'm not sure that there's any wholesale changes in the ultimate product.
Are there any other questions for our panelists here? I think we're pretty much at 3 o'clock. For those of you that are bracing to run out and grab that second sandwich, or head back to the office, or go home, whatever works for you. Are there any other questions before we wrap up? If not, please join me in giving our panelists a hand.